If you've been thinking about using ancient grains in your kitchen and your baking, then stick around, because in this video, I want to talk about what ancient grains are, how they're different from modern wheat, how they're different in their performance when you bake with them, what you might need to know about milling them at home, where to get them if they're pricier than modern wheat, and all the questions you probably have around ancient wheat. So first of all, ancient grains really are mostly ancient wheat varieties. They have not been modernized and hybridized. They have been around for thousands of years. In some cases, they are believed to be at least 7,000 to maybe 10,000 or 13,000 years old. And they, as I said, they have not been hybridized. Modern wheat actually, in my opinion, was mostly created for bakers and not for consumers. Let me explain why. So you know that a grain grows on a stalk and has, I don't even know what it's called, but the kernel's up on top of the stalk. The longer the stalks are, the more they're going to flap in the wind, where when they get really heavy, they tip over. So they make them harder to harvest. So as a result, what farmers did is they bred a variety that has shorter stalks. Also, they wanted higher yield. As a result, they bred wheat kernels that were bigger, and that means more starch and less bran. Now the bran we know is fiber, and that's really good for you, but the starch is, the endosperm is what contains the gluten. And then they have created wheat varieties that have a particularly high content of gluten, because gluten is what gives your baked goods structure, and bakers love that because cakes and breads and rolls, everything gets really fluffy and airy because you can add additional leaveners into it and everything blows up, and you know, the little air holes that are created in the baked goods are held by the gluten structure, which is essentially a scaffolding. Now, as a result, I think that we're missing out. So what are ancient grains? Ancient grains in examples are, I need to make sure I'm showing you the right things. I have here einkorn, which is believed to be the oldest ancient grain. Then I have emmer, which is probably the next oldest, and kamut, which I don't have. Then I have some hurani berries, which are really exciting, and I'm going to talk to you about a little later in this video. We have spelt, which is a bit of a newer variety. And then some people will also include berries such as rye and oats, teff, which are completely gluten-free, millet, which is completely gluten-free, and then there's some other sorghum. So it really depends on who you're asking. And then we have some heritage grains, if you're wondering about those. Those are typically the red 5, the white sonora, the turkey red wheat, and probably even this one. And they're called heritage because they're older than 1950s, but have been bred or created or crossed in the last, in like the previous 100 years, between maybe 1850 and 1950. So they're not exactly ancient, but they are heritage, and they still have it's fun when you're recording and the garbage truck comes by and everybody's blowing leaves in their garden. So if you hear some background noise, you know what that is. So having introduced the different types of ancient grains, how are they different from modern wheat? And I've alluded to this. First of all, they contain a higher ratio of bran to endosperm, and I don't have any wheat, but if you, for example, compare the einkorn to the spelt is still considered an ancient wheat, but the einkorn is much smaller, and they're often a little finicker to harvest or to mill, but they contain a lot more nutrients and they are so flavorful. I always like to think that modern wheat basically tastes like ice cream with no flavor. And once you taste vanilla ice cream or you add extra flavors into it, you don't want to go back to just plain ice cream with no flavor in it. And Some people are, it takes a little getting used to the new flavors. Some are a little nutty or some are a little sweet. But then aside from that, like I said, the vitamins and the minerals and the nutrients, for example, einkorn has a lot of beta carotene, which is very similar to what you find in carrots. And kamut, for example, gives your breads and baked goods a bit of a reddish hue. So you can see that oftentimes with the color also comes nutrient content, and the ancient grains are just so much more nutrient dense than modern hybridized wheat. Since ancient grains contain less gluten, they're often more digestible, and I have heard from a lot of people, and this is basically more anecdotal evidence than anything scientifically proven, that a lot of people with gluten sensitivities do really well on ancient grains. I'm not talking about celiacs because they have a absolute gluten allergy, and I don't recommend trying ancient grains if you are a true celiac. However, if you find that cutting out wheat products makes you feel better, it's definitely worth trying ancient grains, especially einkorn, because it is so easy to digest, and especially if you let your breads undergo a sourdough fermentation, or if you're making a pie crust, or if you're using sourdough to ferment your baked goods rather than using yeast or baking powder. Also, sustainability is another issue that I really value. Oftentimes ancient grains are a lot more pest resistant, they need less water, they're more adaptable to hotter climates, and they promote a variety of biodiversity and so forth. So I think that it is actually worth supporting ancient grains, and oftentimes ancient grains are grown by small farmers, and it's always nice to support a small business rather than big conglomerates. Now you're probably wondering, how can you use them in your baking at home? First of all, I do recommend that you mill them fresh, and I absolutely love the mock mill grain mills. They're super high quality, and I'm going to leave a link below on a video that I have, and also have it here, in which I talk about the different mock mill grain mill models and how you might determine which one works best for you. But there are also other high quality grain mills such as the Como or Nutri-Mill, so it's definitely worth checking them out. So if you mill them, they might behave a little bit differently than your regular wheat berries that you can completely, and you can buy organic wheat berries and you can mill them at home, and you probably have a much superior product than what you get in a store. However, back to milling them at home. Quick side note, why would you want to mill them at home? Well, first of all, fresh milled flour contains all the enzymes and all the nutrients out of the grain, especially if you use them in your baking right away rather than storing them. I don't recommend storing whole grain flours. There is an exception. I did buy some spelt flour at Azure Standard, but I do keep it in the freezer because that will actually prolong the shelf life. If you buy whole grain flours in the store, you never really know how long it's been sitting on the shelves, and the longer it sits, the less nutrient dense it will be. And that's why you want to mill them at home. So having said that, because they have a different hardness and because of the different size of the grains, they might behave a little bit different, and you might have to adjust a little bit the fineness or coarseness of your flour, and then also depending on your own preference. Some people like a coarser grind and they get a bit more chewy texture, and then other people don't like to see the bran so much and they want more of a uniform flour, and that's where you want to adjust it to the finest setting. Now, how can you use them at home? They will perform a little bit different, again, which is why bakers love modern wheat, because it performs beautifully every single time. Ancient grains are a little bit different. For example, spelt absorbs a little less water, so you may want to adjust your liquid a little bit down. Einkorn tends to absorb water a little bit slower, so your dough might feel really sticky in the beginning. Also, because of its weaker gluten structure, you want to avoid over kneading. So sometimes it's a little bit getting used to and experimenting, and again, a little side note, I always love to tell people, don't talk about failures. And if you really would like to incorporate ancient grains into your home baking, don't be discouraged if you don't have a success right away, or if your product doesn't turn out the way you want it. Just keep experimenting, take some notes, and see how you can improve from there. Having said that, I think it's really easy to dip your toes into ancient grains by going slow. And most of the ancient grains you can substitute 1-to-1 in most recipes, a little asterisk, again, experimenting. What you can do is, if you have, let's say, a favorite bread recipe, replace 10% of the wheat flour with, let's say, spelt flour or emmer flour. And if you like the product, then you replace 20% of the wheat flour with your ancient grain flour. And then you work your way up. I have found that oftentimes a really good ratio is 50-50. I have a bread recipe that I featured recently, and I used 50%, or probably a little closer to 60% whole grain spelt flour, and then I used some organic modern wheat flour. And that gives me the best of both worlds. It still has a nice gluten structure, it has nice airy holds, but it also has a better taste. Now, if you're going 100% ancient grain, you might have to be prepared for a completely different taste. And while I think that the taste is superior and amazing, and it's almost like comparing to wine. If you are a wine lover and you love just one uniform taste, then you just grab a blend. But if you are somebody who likes a certain vintage from a certain vineyard, and you like the different distinct flavors of this one compared to that one, and character versus, always getting the same product, then that's a little bit like that. And you might have a favorite ancient grain, so it's definitely worth trying them all. Or you might just like them all, just like me. I don't have a favorite one. I love them all. And then I have another bread recipe, which I'm also linking here and in the description box below, which is super easy. It's the one that I grew up on. And it's essentially, I bake it in a loaf pan, so I don't have to worry about gluten structure because the pan holds the loaf together. And typically what I do is I just throw whatever grains, and I literally mean I don't measure. I have an idea of how much I need, but I just throw everything into my grain mill. And oftentimes I put some buckwheat berries in it because buckwheat also has a lot of health benefits. And I just switch it up all the time. If I run out of one grain, then I'll use a little bit more of some others. And yes, it is a denser loaf. For somebody who grew up in Germany like me, it is very familiar, and this is what we eat over there. But for many Americans used to Wonder Bread, this may be a complete change and a big switch. So start going slow. Also, because of the different gluten, or the lesser amount of gluten, spelt, I find, behaves very different to wheat, and you can probably replace it 1-to-1. You can even buy white spelt flour if you'd like to use that. It's still nutritionally more superior than modern wheat, and it, like I said, performs very similarly. Einkorn doesn't so much, so einkorn is better for cookies or pie crusts or something where you're not relying on the gluten providing the structure for bread and rising, and if you want it all light and airy. By the way, if you're interested in using einkorn, which is probably one of the more popular ancient grains, I recommend this book by Carla Bartolucci, and she has a lot of recipes and also talks a lot about how to exactly get the kind of result that you're looking for and how to get the best out of einkorn. Again, the link will be in the description box for you to find it. And back to gluten, also handling your dough if you're making bread might be a lot different. Some doughs tend to be a little stickier and some doughs tend to be a little bit drier. So there's a little bit of experimentation. If sometimes you can find specific recipes for, let's say, a kamut bread or a rye bread. Rye, for example, on the other hand, just as a side note, rye needs sourdough because the sourdough, as I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong here, and sometimes I remember kind of like the gist, but not like specifically how it works, but I understand it that the enzyme activity in the sourdough is needed to break up the rye. You can't bake rye bread with yeast. So that's another thing. And like I said, just experiment, start, go slow, and see what you can do. I'm sure your family will love the health benefits of your baked good, and I'm sure you're gonna love the different flavors. Are they more expensive? Yes, they are. And the reason is that, first of all, anything that is produced in large quantities can often be mass-produced cheaper, which is the case for modern wheat. And small farmers oftentimes have a smaller operation and they can't be as efficient, but also because they have less yield, and oftentimes they are a little bit finicker to harvest or to mill, because you can't mill them the same way that you mill modern wheat. They tend to be a little bit more expensive, but I think it's worth it, and I don't think there's a price tag on your health. I quickly wanted to tell you about Horani. This is an ancient actual wheat that I learned about and that I have been baking with, that I find super exciting because I always love a story behind something. In the Masada fortress, they found in the 1960s kernels that had survived for 2,000 years. And some people, some researchers, as I recall correctly, went and took them home, bred them, and since then they have been available because farmers have been breeding them, and it is a true ancient wheat. It behaves a little bit like an ancient wheat, so it's not going to be like your modern wheat, but I always love a story, and also the link will be in the description box for you below. Where can you get ancient grains? Really good question, and once you have a few sources, you'll actually find that they're pretty easy to get. I love to get them either from Azure Standard. I recently made a video about it. You can go to Thrive Market. I love Central Milling because Central Milling actually has a brick and mortar store close to my home, so I can actually drive there. Sometimes it's worth ordering from them, but they carry a big variety of ancient grains. You can go to Bob's Red Mill. You can go to Sunrise Flour Mill. And you can even get a lot of high quality ancient grains on good old Amazon. All the links will be in the description box. I'm sure you have questions. Let me know in the comments what questions you have. I hope you give ancient grains a try. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching, and I'll see you in the next video.